For self to exist, there must be a relationship. So, what is a relationship?
Well, I think the relationship is simply consciousness and matter.
Did consciousness give us choice so that we experience what is it to be it? Did consciousness have the choice to evolve and to be the evolution that they were a part of? Choice is therefore imminent because consciousness itself also chose the evolution.
I think definitely choice and consciousness, they can't be separated. If there's an idea of consciousness and self, then it has to have some choice. Consciousness can evolve to actually have more choice. And it can devolve in a way to have less choice.
And so according to the level of consciousness,
yes,
the choice,
the amount of free will that one has.
Oh my God. First, what is the sense of self even? Like that's I guess we should be the first question. And then how someone so wise went through that experience of
well, I was just talking about this the other day with a group of people because we were discussing an author who had written a book basically saying that in order to realize who you are and to actuate it or actualize your potential, at some point you have to reject and become dispassionate or without emotion or without, in other words, you have to develop a sense of detachment. And I think there's some truth to that, but I think for me personally, almost all of the experiences that I've had that I value, that were moments of like awakening or realization, came from feeling loved. They came from moments where someone helped me in a way that was unexpected. And it happened many different ways. But every time I felt where I really was able to make progress, it was after I was helped by someone else or the universe or whatever. In other words, when I felt like I had a sense of being loved. And that gave me in each of these instances some extra energy that kind of like broke through a barrier, and allowed me to get clearer on something that was not clear at the time. And so I'm just a believer in the power of love. I think that when we share and we help each other, we're actually doing something really, really vital, in that we're giving something to someone that they're going to be able to transform into something even bigger. In other words, when you help someone else out, you give them some type of energy that they can then take in and unlock new potential within them.
Does the sense of self happen because of the other? Would you say absolutely yes?
I don't think it happens because of the other. I think that it's always in relationship. And I think the beginning, the self is nothing without relationship. In other words, it's always in relation to something, even if it's just our own body. I think the self is like the idea of subject object. And if you have a subject, you have to have an object. Otherwise, there's no subject.
So right? That would be a relationship too that could form the self.
Right. I'm not so sure it forms the self, but it's part of the functionality of the self. In other words, if the self is just the subject in the subject-object relationship, there's no time where there's just a subject and no object. Those two are always, they're like opposite dualities that always exist together. Like
for one to exist, the other form must exist.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So is that the definition of relationship? The polarity of subject and object? Because that's so interesting what you're saying. Basically, then for self to exist, there must be a relationship. So what is a relationship?
Well, I think the relationship is simply consciousness and matter at its most basic. In other words, the self, if we could say that there is a self, or we could say a self with a loose definition, is awareness, and it's awareness of something. In other words, awareness can't exist as just awareness. It's always awareness of something. So awareness is, you could say, being completed by the object that it's seeing. You know, and whatever the object is can't exist unless it's seen. So they need each other, like this awareness or seeing process and something to be seen. And they kind of work together to create what we know as life or reality.
I was having that conversation with a girl also from here the other day, because then that means that without observation and without attention, there's no relationship. We're going down layers.
Yeah, in other words, if there's no attention, I would say that it's not that things don't exist that we don't see. It's just that when we're in this room, right? We're just seeing this room, right? But there's actually earth below us, right? Rocks, right? And there's actually air above us, above this room, right? So in a way, we're in relationship to these things that we can't see. Even though we may not be aware, I might not know like how deep the rock goes before there's molten lava straight down below me. But whatever's there, I'm in relationship to that right now, whether I know about it or not. So I think that when we look at relationship between the self and the objects or the world, phenomenal world, we have to realize that relationship is much bigger than what we're immediately aware of. Like I'm in relationship to a blue whale who's off the coast of Antarctica right now.
Or even to maybe Pluto and Uranus.
Exactly.
No, it is true.
I mean,
it's crazy.
If there is a subject-object relationship, if there is a connection, if there is, which I'm not saying there is, because if you look at the subject, if the subject is awareness and object is a material object, it's hard to see how they're related other than this functional relation. There's not much similarity between consciousness and matter, right? They don't resemble each other.
They don't. Just the exchange of energy.
Yeah. There's some kind of
reflection of energy.
There's some kind of need, right? There's some kind of codependency between the two.
There is. You're actually right. So the object only exists, I would say, as a reflection of the subject, as a reflector of the subject, I guess. But the subject needs the object for what? That's my question.
Why does the subject need the object?
Because for me, it's obvious why the object needs the subject. However, the other way around, not so obvious.
Well, some people would say that the subject needs an object to become aware of itself.
Oh, because
in other words, it's like we can't.
Wow.
The eye, if you look, the eyeball can never see the eyeball. Like the eyeball can look at the eyeball, but only indirectly through a mirror or something else that's reflecting back to it. Can't see itself, right? So we could say that consciousness is like that. It's using matter in a way to become aware of itself.
Wow. I think we just answered the question that I heard the other day in the podcast. Are you ready? This is pretty deep, but I love it. Did consciousness use evolution to discover itself? Or did evolution create consciousness as a mean to develop itself?
Right. No, this is the ancient question of which came first, consciousness or matter.
Or matter, I guess. Yes, if evolution will be matter, yes.
If it was evolution, that's more of the common scientific notion as this possibility that consciousness is created by the brain, right? Mm-hmm. Our brain is an organ of creation and it creates consciousness. But of course, the ancient thinkers like Plato said the other way around. They said that the brain, consciousness came first, then the brain.
Okay, so consciousness created evolution as a way to get to know itself.
Right. Consciousness is, Plato would say that evolution is consciousness. In other words, consciousness is all the laws by which matter obeys in its interaction, gravity, shapes, whatever. And evolution is some kind of law in terms of governing changes of animals, right? I mean, animals and plants. In other
Oh,
words,
wow.
animals and plants go through changes over time, they evolve, right? But the laws that govern those changes and how it actually happens is part of consciousness.
So, to put it super simple that a kid could understand, consciousness is the courtroom and evolution is the judge or the lawyer in the courtroom.
I would say that the other way around. Evolution is the courtroom and consciousness is the judge. In other words, consciousness is
But
the...
then, wait, sorry, let me just refute this. But then the courtroom can exist without the judge. However, the judge without the courtroom cannot operate, cannot exist, cannot perform.
The judge needs the courtroom
Yeah.
in order to function.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the courtroom does not need the judge to operate. On that, we agree, right?
The courtroom needs a judge.
Why do you say so? Because for me,
How
can
could
exist.
anything happen in a courtroom without a judge? I mean, it would just be might as well be a lunchroom.
Yeah, but it still exists, and
But
yet
it's not functioning as a place of justice.
Okay, you're right. It's not function for
It's just a room then.
its purpose.
Right. Consciousness gives the purpose. Purpose comes from consciousness.
Without consciousness, there's no purpose.
Absolutely. There's no order. I mean, consciousness otherwise is just chaos, right?
I have a conversation with my grandma actually on my show, and she says that what is death? Death is when the chaos becomes so superior that it's too big for the body, that it ceases to be within the dimensions of the body, and so. But from what I'm understanding from you, when we die, we're still part of the chaos, right? We would still be part. If
Well,
that
when
is a good definition of chaos, of death and chaos, does that make sense? Are we?
Well, it depends what you mean by we, right? I mean, Plato would say that the body dies, not who we are. In other words, consciousness is not dependent on this particular body. Consciousness actually can function in a variety of different bodies. It always needs a body, but it's not confined. In other words, when this body fails, that's not the end of consciousness. Consciousness finds another body or actually uses a different body that's available.
Automatically, or it takes a little bit, lingers a little bit in the realm of the consciousness and then comes back down? Because I wonder about that too. Because if as soon as we die, we automatically reincarnate, or if we take a little bit of time and then...
Well, I think there's the idea that I've read is that when we die, it's rare to immediately reincarnate, but consciousness then has more of a energetic body. In other words, consciousness can function in a body that's not so heavy material. There's a way that there's a finer material, like a higher dimension or a finer form of energy that can be a body for consciousness. In other words, this idea of like that there are higher realms, and that in those realms there are kind of angelic-like beings or other kinds of beings that have different kinds of bodies. They're not physical. They're not physical like ours. They're made up of kinds of energy, more subtle.
Okay.
That's one way to think about it, I think.
So we would dwell in that in those sort of frequencies and energies.
Yeah, in other words, there might be a transitional period where we
are those.
And it can last longer. I mean, I think there's a lot of variety, right? I mean, the opinions on this that I've studied say that it's not one type of journey for everyone. It depends a lot on your intentions, your desires, your beliefs, your behaviors. Like there's a lot of different factors that could come into play.
Well, one of my conversations tonight about the self was that, and this is something I believe, but I wonder if you will refute it, is that the self for me is proven to exist and to be something, to be an organism, or to be a concept because of the choice, because one can choose. Going back to the consciousness conversation, did consciousness give us choice so that we experience what is it to be it in terms of consciousness? Because did consciousness have the choice to evolve and to be the evolution that they were a part of. And therefore, choice is therefore imminent because consciousness itself also chose the evolution. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think definitely choice and consciousness they can't be separated. Like if there's an idea of consciousness and a self, then it has to have some choice. But I think that consciousness can evolve to actually have more choice, and it can devolve in a way to have less choice.
Ooh.
And it
So
all
according to the level of consciousness,
yes,
the choice,
the amount
oh
of free
my
will that one
God.
has.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
Because
so they're
obviously,
both, sorry, they both exist. Free will and determinism is just a matter of the levels of consciousness.
well, yes. In other words,
Wow.
I don't think I don't believe in absolute determinism. Like I think in absolute determinism, my opinion is that negates free choice. In other words, there is no such thing as absolute determinism, but there is degrees of determinism. In other words, the more someone is determined means the more they're unconscious about the conditioning and how that affects their actions, the more unconscious they are about their genetics and how that affects their actions, the more unconscious they are about maybe past lives and how that affects their actions. So in other words, the more that you become aware of the determining factors, the pressures that you're experiencing, the more free you can be. The more you can make a choice that is aware of all these pressures and yet can choose actually independently of them. But the more unaware of you are, and the more that you act as if you're free, the more that you think that you're free, actually, the more determined you are and the less free that you are.
It's almost like a balance, or like a, they go.
One goes up, the other goes down.
Yeah.
Right?
I love this because I don't know if you've heard, there's lots of ways to calculate consciousness. I know that there's the levels of consciousness, the maps of consciousness states that one can have related to frequencies and states of being and states of mind. Have you heard about that? Yeah, I'm sure you have. And then there's also the other one, which is something I talk about in almost every conversation, and I love that it's just happened now, which is the levels of consciousness that this guy laid out, that there's 4. Have you heard about that?
What
roughly? So the first one is dogmatic view of the world. You have yet to question anything, and you're just doing the exact same choices as your ancestors and what you've been taught. Level 2, you start to understand how much of your thoughts create your reality and how much of how you perceive the world is through your lenses. Level 3, which I believe where we both are, you meditate quite regularly, if not every day, and you start to ascend, and you actually start to have different sensations and different feelings and different awareness because of the meditation. Level 4 is when you can see colors and you can perceive the light through colors. And what I've heard from this guy that lit
see
it up,
colors in meditation, you're talking about.
No,
Because
no,
otherwise everybody sees colors, right?
No, but like you are awake.
Oh.
And you see.
You have visions of
colors, and you make your decisions based on those colors.
I see.
I've yet to experience that. I hope one day I'll get there. But another aspect of it is that is the world that you change. So basically, you're here to serve the world, and those colors help you make the decisions based on the emotion that they carry and the energy and the frequency that they carry. And also, there's no desires. There's only choices. So meaning that the self has no desire for anything. Everything just happens, and then the colors come, and then it's chosen upon, I guess, the necessity of the next thing that needs to be done to serve the world, I guess. So these are
like
the
a
4,
selfless state.
Yes, almost. So these are the 4 levels but can this relate to what we were saying in terms of the higher, this 4th level, meaning that there'll be, but then at the same time, the desire is not choice, right? Desire is not the same as choice. But in this 4th level, there's no desires. There's the choice of colors. And I don't know, I'm trying to understand if what we said, that the higher the consciousness, the higher the choice, or the higher of free will, and the lower the consciousness, the bigger the determinism. And I was wondering if it can tap into this concept of the 4 levels of consciousness.
It could possibly. I mean, for me, it doesn't really work very well because I consider myself very much a dogmatist. Like I've had this idea mainly from Plato that there are fixed laws.
The dogma serves its purpose.
Yeah, there is fixed laws that when we recognize and we come into alignment with, we harmonize, we live better lives. In other words,
such as?
Well, let's say generosity.
Mm.
That's a fixed law. Anybody who's generous benefits themselves to the degree that they're generous. Like it just automatically comes back in many different ways. Let's say truthfulness in the same way, like being trustworthy person, being a non-deceptive person, speaking truth whenever possible, being direct, is a law of the universe, such that we can accomplish our goals, what's really good for us, the more that we adhere to these kinds of laws. You know, so I'm very much a dogmatist in that way, and I think that consciousness itself is encoded just like gravity and the other law we were talking about. I forget what it was, but just as there are certain laws in the physical world, like evolution, we were talking about how things evolve. Just as there are laws in the physical world that govern how things happen, there are laws in relating to consciousness, how we actualize and actually acquire true happiness, true joy in our lives. And I think those obey just as strict laws as matter does when an apple falls from a tree. So I'm very much a dogmatist, and I don't really believe in like just the power of that our thoughts create reality. I think that our thoughts, when they're aligned with the way things work, they make things better for us. But when our thoughts are out of harmony and they contrast with the way things work in life, then we don't actually achieve what we want. And so we can't manifest things in that way.
I love that, by the way. Thank you, because I talk about so many levels of consciousness, and I don't think anyone has understood the concept well enough to refute it the way you did. So I appreciate it a lot. I wonder though, but were those dogmas placed upon you as you went through life, or did you have to question anything that was taught to you as a kid or in your upbringing, your education, to get to this level?
For sure. I mean, I think we have conditioning. We have
what he was talking
conditioning
about.
that's not accurate. In other words, there are these fixed laws. That's the true dogma. But we've been taught things that are not actually the true dogma. We've been taught for the wrong reasons. In other words, we've been misled. We've been lied to. And so to be able to determine and distinguish between what's true and what's actually manipulating us is a challenge. So we do have to think for ourselves in those cases.
And how can one? I mean, you and I think we've both done it, but I think one of the things that I like to have it on here is how can we help people have that discernment? Because I think that's the really key word, discern the things that were placed upon you that can actually be helpful and can be good dogmas, and the dogmas that we must, in a way, alienate ourselves from in order to, have, I would say, more freedom in this case, if what we're saying is true. And I will think as well after I stop talking, but if you
well, it's not an easy, it's a big problem. It's a big problem because if I was talking to someone who had some faith in a tradition, right? A tradition that was originally started by someone, a wise person, I would say my advice to them would be go back to that original person's teaching and read and study, because you will get a lot from that direct person's original words. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of help available there for determining what you've been taught that you need to get rid of because it was a lie, and what is actually valuable. So these traditions have a lot to offer, but they're very, it's rare that I meet someone who has faith in any of these traditions and is actually willing to go back and study the original words. Like, because all these religions, mostly religions, they have so many years of tradition that have been added to those original words. And so it's created something that's not true to the original in a lot of cases. And most people are familiar with that modern version, and they're not used to, they haven't been trained, they're not really comfortable like going back to the original teachings. But if I met someone who I can convince, I mean, I'm always trying to convince people, Christians, to like go back to the Gospels. I say this to people all the time. Read the Gospels. I'll read it with you. Let's go page by page. Let's get a modern version and let's look through it.
What's special about the Gospels?
Well, the Gospels are just, when you read the original teachings of Jesus in a really good translation, and this is not the average translations that have been given through most of our history, there's incredible challenging things to think about. I mean, this conversation we're having, really stimulating conversation. The Gospels open this potential up to have these kinds of conversations with anybody. I mean, anybody is forced to think really deeply about things when they read Jesus's direct words. I mean, they're very provoking, and they really touch on, I would say, he touches on, and he tries to lead the listener to think about what are the true doctrine, what is the true teaching. In other words, what's behind consciousness itself in determining why life is meaningful, what's going on, how do things happen, like all these kinds of questions. So I think whether it's Jesus or whether it's the Buddha or my favorite, Plato, these kinds of things.
Plato should be considered a prophet, I would agree.
I definitely
And he's not. I don't know why, but he's not. But I wonder, so the Gospels are not edited, or the ones that you had access to, they were not edited to an extent that they were written in ways that are more accurate to what Jesus was saying?
Well, I'm saying the translations, the modern translations, because...
I'm sorry, because I have no idea what the Gospels are. I should know, because I was raised Catholic, but I have no idea.
So the Gospels, are in Greek. They're the same Greek, no matter what. But we have access to translations today that are much more direct and much more and less loaded. In other words, I think a lot of the translations of the Bible that have happened over the past 2,000 years have had some political motives. People like, let's fudge this a little bit. We don't, I don't really like what Jesus said here. Let's change, let's soften it up. So you can actually get versions today that don't have any of that in it. And that's like a breath of fresh air. When I first read one of those Gospels, it changed my life, really.
Wow.
Yeah. And just like, whoa, there's so much more powerful.
But what was it, like the powerful words or the wisdom?
The words, the character. I mean, Jesus' character comes across. He's like a unique, like sage-like person, like when you read Plato's dialogues and you read about Socrates, I mean, it's just, I think it's almost impossible not to love him because he's such a beautiful person. Like, and just the way he acts and the way he interacts.
A dialogue, and it's like, you're there. It's quite fascinating. I was actually going to ask you that because I started reading Great Hippus, like you told me to, and I don't think I've ever been engaged in this specific way. It's not necessarily as in emotionally engaged or intellectually engaged. It's just an engagement that I've yet to experience with any other dialogue. And do you know what I'm trying to say?
Definitely.
And I don't know what it is. And it's just like, I just want to keep reading. And I don't have a strong emotion, like, like fear or whatever, but neither don't have the desire to keep going. So what is it that it does something to you? Like,
well,
crazy.
I say it's like when, reality TV first came out.
Ooh.
Like there was something just so engaging of that because you were watching, it was like, oh, it's real. These people are actually fighting. Like they're somewhere in this house. There's no scripted, like there's something like really seductive about that. And I think that's what comes across in the dialogues. Now, to me, and I have a opinion that's not like the average opinion, on this topic, but for me, those dialogues actually happened. They were real conversations that happened in history, and that's why we're engaged, because we're reading something real. It's not like a creative fabrication on Plato's part. This conversation really happened, and we can feel that, and that's what pulls us in.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think I can see them together, even though the image in my imagination is fabricated through something that I've seen throughout my life. I'm placed there.
Right.
Maybe that's what you're saying. Wow,
Yeah,
that's
I mean, it's like, I think that a lot of great movies that have really great conversation, writers who actually recorded real conversations.
I was going to say that, probably,
them,
right?
Right? Because you can tell when a
be.
conversation is really perfect in a movie, you're like, oh, he couldn't have written that one. Like, that's just too perfect. He recorded that somewhere, he saw it and witnessed it and put it into the movie.
God, yeah, probably. I do a lot of improv theater, and that's one of the veins of my craft that I'm really passionate about as an actor. And I do think that, I don't know, I've yet to experience an audience member telling me this, but the most truthful moments for me as an actor were improvised, because it's almost like a conversation, even though it's acting, because there's people looking at me.
Especially if you're interacting in a very real way with the people you're on stage with, right? I mean, if it's not just you improv, if it's a number of other people, like, it's real. I mean, if the more that you have that talent of forgetting the audience and like just being with those people and really relating to them, I think that comes across, and it's very attractive.
Yeah, so maybe that's why the dialogues are so. I mean, let's see what happens to me.
Yeah.
I don't want to take too much of your time. I think this was really great.
Thanks.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it's fun. Good talking to you.
Thanks, you too. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. I mean, I do know, I have an idea, but I love that we actually talked about it. We started at self and then went through the evolution and consciousness. I don't know if we got we attained an answer in that one, but we might in another conversation. But